Good evening, my name is Jack Barnes. Tonight I'm talking about Nick Leeson. Nick Leeson was a British futures trader who ended up causing the collapse of caused the collapse of the second oldest merchant bank in the entire world, Barings Bank. Now I'm going to explain the backstory to the bank, Nick Leeson, and then explain what happened. This is just a small overview of what happened. There's a lot more detail to the whole situation than what I'm going to state, but I'm just going to state a little bit of the story of what happened in this famous financial event in the world history that happened in 1995. So, I will get into it. Barings was created by German immigrants in Britain in 1762 by John and Francis Baring. They were the sons of a German family who had migrated to Britain in that period, and they established a merchant banking firm under that name. Now, Barings became a very large bank. In the old days, it took part in the Napoleonic Wars, funding loans to the British government, alongside Rothschild Bank that's still around today, but Rothschild Bank is a lot smaller than it used to be. Additionally, it also helped out in the American Civil War, and as well in the Second World War, and after the Second World War helped the British government liquidate assets, meaning that they were closing down businesses and assets and getting the assets to gain back the wealth from the assets. However, Barings, like a lot of old institutions of their time, ended up not coping in the modern age. In the 20th century alone, literally technology changed so quickly that literally a lot of companies couldn't keep up and couldn't cope with the changes in the changes in the time. So what ended up happening was Barings ended up becoming very behind in a lot of the financial institutions. So I will then now get on to the next thing. There is a thing, I will just get it up, I'll just draw it up now. Alright, I will explain now some things to do with derivatives. Now, derivatives are a contract which derives the value from the performance of the underlying entity. Now, that may not sound quite clear to you if you're not doing finance, but in finance you have arrangements. Arrangements such as contracts to buy things for a certain price and then get them at a certain time. Now, there are different types of derivatives: shares, futures, forwards, options, a whole lot of them. I will go through a couple of them now just to explain what they're like, because this will be important for the story of Nick Leeson, for the story in this financial financial outline. So, futures and forward contracts. Now, futures and forwards are very similar. They're virtually a contract that states, I agree to buy this, we'll talk about this pen. Well, actually, no, I'll draw it on the board to make it simple. We'll call this person Jim. And we'll call this person Ben. Now, Ben is a farmer. And at harvest time, the price of crops go down because there's an oversupply of crops. So Ben wants to hedge his risk. Now, hedging is the moving of risk to another person or to another thing. So Ben wants to hedge his risk, so he undertakes a futures contract. Good old Ben has a contract here. There's a little signature there. Now Ben states that if you buy his contract, he will sell you. If you buy, so presently, what's the date today? It's the 11th. Oh crap. I've got mine on the American settings. Alright, so it's the 16th today. Alright, actually, we'll go back a couple of days. It's the 14th today. In this example. Now Ben says, if you buy my crops contract for $5 today, this contract on the we'll change it again because it needs. I'll explain why the number of days is important later. We'll change it to the 10th. So it's the 16th today. Alright. So Ben's said wants to hedge his risk and he wants to get rid of So Ben wants to hedge the risk. He wants to hedge the risk to make sure when the price of the crops drop in harvest season, that he can get a good price for his crops. So, in the futures contract, you're setting a price to sell at, and the amount to sell at. So, Ben's done the contract, he said on the 10th, if you buy it for $5 on the 10th, if you agree to do this contract, you can buy it on the 16th for $5. For $5. If you enter that contract. So Jim enters the contract with Ben because he wants, we'll just say Ben's working for Hungry Jack's and they need wheat for the hamburgers. So Jim says, alright, well Hungry Jack's needs to set their prices a year in advance, or a couple of days in advance. So we would like that futures contract because then we can set our prices and set our prices so we don't have to change them with the market and just stick with a spot rate. So they use a spot rate and a forward rate, or a futures rate. So what ends up happening is, gets to the 16th, so then Jim buys the contract for $5. And he owns the wheat, so the crops from Ben. So that's a futures contract. Now, a forward contract is virtually the same. There is only a couple of differences. A futures contract is done on the exchange market. It is regulated. The forward contracts is done on the OTC, over the counter. That means that you can Ben over here just rings up Jim and says, I want to do the contract. It's not done on a proper exchange market. It's just over the counter, as it says. It can be done anywhere. Now, there's a bit of a problem with this. Forward contracts aren't related to the story, but I'll just explain it. Forward contracts have a lot of risk involved because they're not regulated. on a proper market, so a lot of bugger ups can happen. While the futures are done on a proper market, they're regulated and they have something very important that is involved in the story. So, we got futures here, and I think we get the, and I'll just explain a bit more about futures so we understand clearly. When you do a futures, you have to include a specification explaining the date you're going to pick up the asset, the time, the location, the amount you're going to pay. Everything's got to be in the specification. Additionally, the bit I'm about to get into is about defaulting, and this has a very important thing to do with the story, so we'll get on to that. Now, the futures market has very little risk, little to no risk. The reason is because of a thing called a margin account. Now, a margin account is meant to stop people from defaulting. Now, what ends up happening is, I'll just show you. Alright, let's do this. I'll just explain another thing with futures. There is a thing called the spot rate. The spot rate is done at the present. That's the present value. Now, a spot rate is done when you do the deal for a spot rate. It takes 2 business days to happen. Now, if the contract was within those 2 days, was on the 2-day mark, that wouldn't be counted as a futures or forward contract. That would be counted as a spot contract. Now, that means that you can't do the futures start stuff. That's why when I was doing the time, I was making sure to change the dates, because it has to be more than 2 days. Alright, let's explain the margin account. Now, to stop people from defaulting, there's a thing called the margin account. The margin account is meant to minimize the risk of people defaulting on their futures contracts, because it's regulated on the market. This doesn't happen for forward contracts, I believe. I could be wrong about that, but from what I know, forward contracts are not included in this. And from the calculations from risk management and international finance at RMIT. But what ends up happening is, it's meant to minimize the risk of you defaulting on your futures contract. So what the account is actually, it's a backup bit of money. So if the money goes below a certain point, I'll just explain with an example. So you start off on an initial margin. So we'll put 15,000 as an initial margin. Now there's a specific percentage. I can't quite remember the specific percentage right now because I don't have my notes with me, but I will just explain it. So we start off with an initial margin there. Now this point is called the maintenance margin. Now, you start on an initial margin, and this is meant to prevent you from defaulting. The amount will get lower or higher depending on how you're going financially. But what ends up happening is, if you get to the maintenance margin point, that means you've gone below the specific point that says, holy crap, you're in risk of defaulting on the futures contract. So we'll just say, now this number's not going to be correct because I don't have the percentage of what it's meant to be, but we'll just say it's 13,000. So it's got below the maintenance margin point, and everyone's going, holy crap, Jim is about to default on his futures contract. This isn't good. This is really bad. So Jim gets a phone call called the margin call. So they ring him up and they go, hey Jim, we need you to fill up your margin account or your maintenance margin. Do this now or you're going to be kicked. I believe you're kicked from the exchange. I could be wrong about that, but it's not good if you default. So what ends up happening is they get the initial margin. They get 15,000. Take away the maintenance margin of 13,000. That gives you 12,000. Sorry. That gives you 2,000. So then we have that, and then we plus that on to the maintenance margin. So we go plus 13,000 plus 2,000 equals 15,000. Now, these are very bold numbers, like just very simple numbers, but if you're doing this in real world, they'll be very hard numbers, not just simple straight numbers like that. But pretty much it gets us back at our initial margin. It returns us to our initial margin. So that's the purpose, and it's meant to protect the market from people from defaulting. And because if people know that people are just going to default, then they won't trust putting their money in the market. So it's meant to keep confidence in the market. So and you have to make margin payments to protect this. So I will explain one more type of derivative, derivative that's in the derivatives market, and that is called options. Now options is not included in this financial outline of history, but I just thought it might be important just to include it, just for a bit of banter and for the sake of it. There are things called options. I'll just explain it. Options. Alright. There are things called options. Now, I actually, when I was trying to buy shares, I asked the stockbroking company if I could do options. I was told that it was probably not a good idea, so I took their advice. But options can be a very risky market, and if you don't know what you're doing, it's probably not a good idea to do it. But I will just explain what options are. Options is like betting. I'll explain how this works. So, what's the best way to explain this? Alright, I'll explain this. So with the call option, actually we'll use Jim and Ben again as a good example. We'll change the names around. Jim and Cheryl. Jim and Cheryl. Now, Cheryl has Goon. Well, use Goon as an example. Please don't put an option for Goon. You're wasting your money. Sharon has Goon, but Jim doesn't have the money to buy the Goon. right at the moment. The price of the goon is $7. The price of the goon is $7. Very good price for goon, I would say. But the price of goon is $7. Jim only has $5. So Jim pays a premium, or pays Sharon $5. Now this is the premium. Jim pays Sharon the $5 to put the goon away for a certain amount of time. They agree on a certain period in time. So we'll say, they say on the 7th. So on this, they say on the 7th, if on the 7th Jim still wants to buy the goon, he will pay the $7 for the goon. So I'll just explain it a bit more clearly. In a put option, a buyer buys the right to buy the call option, or in a call option has the right to buy the asset or the share, while the seller, being Sharon, has the obligation to sell the product. So when she enters into this kind of contract, she's saying she takes the $5 as she has the right to refuse Jim at the start, but once she's taken that $5, she's locked in there. It's Jim that has the right to refuse or take it. So, we'll just explain it again. Jim pays a premium to get the asset. Pays a premium to put the asset out of the market, and says on a certain point in time he will buy that asset for the original price. And so say when it gets to the 7th, Jim goes, and I'll just explain about pricing as well. Say on the 7th the price of goon drops. Jim wouldn't take that option, because now the option is worth $3. The goon's worth, or the asset's worth $3, but his option is still locked in at $7, so he wouldn't take the option. He could just buy it normally. While if it went up to $13, he would take the option because he's getting it for a cheaper price, only paying $7. Now, put options I'm not always the best with. I might even not go into put options. I do know it, but it's just that it's a bit hard to explain. Alright. So we'll get on to the story of Nick Leeson now. Now, what ended up happening in the 1980s was, all around the financial world, all around the world, was these lunatic cowboys in the financial industry had very little regulation, and they'd been buggering up. There'd been a financial crash in Melbourne. It was quite serious, so a lot of people lost their jobs, a lot of people went bankrupt, a lot of people filed for insolvency, so it got pretty bad. And a lot of these things was people had been making these risky investments, and they backfired because there was little to no regulation on a lot of these things. Now, in the 90s, a lot of regulation came in to stop a lot of this misbehaviour happening. Now, unfortunately, as I explained, Barings was a bit behind the times. So I'll just draw up some things now. Alright. So in 1992, Barings bank decided to open a futures and options office in Singapore. Now, in Asia at the time, and around the world, Asia was seen as, so I'll just make sure that's still going right there. Asia was seen as a developing tiger market. Everything was happening in Asia. Now, there was a lot of risk in Asia. The Asian financial crash happened where Thailand and a lot of other Asian nations lost quite a lot of money, and it's still still haven't fully recovered till this day in some of those Asian countries. But now the thing with Barings was they were trying to take advantage of this tiger market in the Far East. So what ended up happening was they opened this office and started doing transactions on the CIMEX. This is the Singaporean exchange, like the ASX in Australia. However, Leeson at this time was appointed the general manager of this office and was sent to head both the front office and back office operations. However, this was a problem. You're meant to have a separation of powers a little bit there. Not figuratively, but literally you can't have people looking after the books while doing the transactions as well. So this was a bit of a problem, and this was definitely a bit of Barings' fault. However, I will just get to it now. Just wait. Leeson was looking after futures. He was one of the heads of the futures contracts on the trading floors. Still using the outcry system. I'll just explain what the outcry system is quickly. The outcry system is where you go sell 5, 6, 7, 8, where you're actually screaming out to buy and you're doing hand signals like this. However, today in most global economies, you use a computerized system. Most of these systems finished by 2000. So the 90s was literally the last time a lot of these outcry systems. I actually went to the stock exchange, the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and I saw their old outcry floor. It's a humongous venue, but all of it's computerized now, so it's a very lovely building, but not that useful compared to what the computer markets use now. But I'll just get back to the point. Leeson was on the futures market and they were making basic losses. However, when you make a loss, you are meant to report it to the head office or to the office. Leeson didn't do that. He put the losses in a computerized account called 5/8 account. The 5/8 account. Now, this is fraud, illegal in every way. You're not meant to do this. So, now I'll just explain what ended up happening. So this computerized file would go to the head office in London from Singapore. However, Leeson had to cover up this fraud. Now, what did he do? He said to London that with these losses, to cover the losses, as I explained with futures contracts, you need to do margin payments. Now, to make sure you don't default on the contracts. So we have, I'll just write margin payments. margin payments right here. However, he couldn't tell London that. So what he did, he rang up London from Singapore, here in London, and he said, London, I need more money to buy more futures contracts for clients. And London said, sure, we'll send you the money. So London sent the money to the 5/8 account to cover the losses. Now, the only problem with Leeson's deception was, and this did not get discovered, in fact, was there were no fees coming from the clients. The clients weren't paying their fees. But the thing was, these clients were pixie dust, they didn't exist. They were made up by Leeson. And this was showing that, this showed how backward, how backward Bearings was. This showed how backward Bearings was because they didn't question why these clients, or these supposed clients, weren't paying their fees. So what ended up happening was, Leeson ended up, he kept doing this for quite a while. However, something then happened. The debt kept building and building and building up. This account became huge. Just we'll say it, just kept getting huger and huger and huger. So, Leeson then got to a point where it was getting really bad. And then, I forgot which date it was, I'll just check. I can't remember the specific date it was, but at a specific date in time, the market finally turned his way, and it wiped out the debt and made Bearings huge amounts of profits. However, instead of learning from his lesson of being fraudulent and lying and breaking the law, he did the same thing again. Now, Bearings was quite happy with this, because Bearings was coming out of a bit of a dark time where they'd done very badly and they'd been losing their prestige as one of the top merchant banks in the world. So, they were very happy with it, and they were very old-fashioned, so they didn't know how to properly look after the exchange. So he was making huge profits, and from their views and from the paper. However, then a problem rose. Bearings started noticing that the fees of their clients weren't coming through, so they sent some auditors from the United Kingdom of Great Britain to Singapore to check this out. Now, if you don't know what auditors are meant to check the books and the accounts of your firm to make sure everything's correct. Now, there are two types of auditing. There's internal and external. Now, if you're an Australian public company, or just in general company, you normally get external auditing to check your books out. And you'll have a financial report released every year, I think after July something, after the end of the financial year, because we have our financial year around June, July. I can't remember the specific dates, but around that time period. So, but they did an internal audit to find out what was happening. According to what Leeson said, apparently the Bearings auditors didn't actually check their accounts, and he was relieved as hell, because he said literally everything that was everything that was around that exchange had some connection to the 5/8 account, and if they properly had a look, they would have caught him virtually in minutes or within days. But according to him, he was very grateful that they didn't catch him at that point. So what ended up happening? Well, Leeson had... I'll just get this up, I'll just draw it up quickly. Okay, as I've drawn here, in late 1993, it was getting pretty bad for Leeson. By then, the account exceeded £2 million in losses. I think that's double for us in Australia, but as well, this is a historical cost, so it's probably even more in today's money. But what ended up happening specifically was, I will just get it up. Leeson ended up absolutely, he panicked. He'd been doing this thing called doubling down, where you make a loss, then you buy it back. Oh, I can't explain it, but he'd been doing this strategy, and it had worked in the past, called doubling down. But doubling down strategy he'd been using worked in the past, but had failed at this point. So he used the options strategy called short straddle. This is a non-directional options trading strategy that involves simultaneously selling a put and call of the same underlying security, strike price, and expiration date. The profit is limited to a premium received from the sale of the put and call option. The risk is virtually unlimited, as large moves of the underlying security's price, either up or down, will cause losses proportional to the magnitude of the price move. Now I will get to what ended up happening to him, and that magnitude and loss thing that I just explained is very important. In 1995, a big event occurred. In Japan, there was an earthquake called the Kobe earthquake. Kobe is a very important city in Japan. It's where a lot of the beef industry is in Japan, and it affected the stock market in Japan. The JPS, JXS, JSX, Japanese Securities Exchange, I'm pretty sure. But pretty much it affected the Japanese exchange a lot. It caused literally the market to plummet. So what Leeson had done was, on the 16th of January that year, Leeson placed a short straddle, the strategy I just explained, in the Singapore market and the Tokyo market, essentially betting that the Japanese stock market would not move significantly overnight. However, when the earthquake hit in the morning on the 17th, this made all the Asian markets around Asia plummet. And Leeson did a thing called a forced Leeson into a thing called a tailspin. Leeson attempted to recover the losses by making a series of increasingly risky new trades, and ended up trying to individually halt the market plummet. And for a little while it did halt the market. However, eventually the market kept plummeting. And as I explained with the definition, the magnitude of the loss is equal to the movement in the price. So if the movement of the price goes down, your losses are going to keep going down. So Leeson was really buggered at this stage. So he ended up saying to the office, he said, oh, and as well, at this time, the Barings has no clue about this. So Barings had quite a shock when they found out about all this and about the 5/8 account. But what ended up happening was Leeson ended up leaving a note saying, "I'm sorry," and fled Singapore with his then wife, Lisa, I believe. Lisa Leeson. And losses eventually reached 827 million, equivalent to 1.4 billion US dollars. That's probably even more for us in Australia. Twice the bank's available, twice Barings' available capital, and after a failed bailout attempt by the Bank of England, it was decided in a late night decision that Barings would finally be closed after nearly 200 years of business. This shocked the world, and it was really devastating for a lot of people. A lot of people trusted Barings and would. The Queen had an account with Barings. A lot of British politicians had accounts with Barings. Famous pop stars and sportsmen and women had accounts with Barings. It was one of the most trusted banks in the world. Their power came from their name, and it was collapsed. Or it was destroyed by this one person. So Leeson ended up pleading guilty on 2 counts of deceiving the bank auditors and cheating the Singapore Exchange, including forging documents, and was sentenced to 6.5 years in Changi Prison in Singapore. Now, this story isn't more really about Nick Leeson. It's more about how the system at Barings was collapsing and how one person took advantage of that. It was so obvious that he was doing these things, but he was making such good profits or such large amounts of money on paper that they had no reason to distrust him. However, that is why we have proper auditors in the financial industry to make sure that things like this don't happen. So that was Nick Leeson, or Leeson.